Tonight should be a fascinating look at the giants of psychology such as Freud and Skinner and their criticism of religion. In Freud's case, it was warfare on religion. The change from the early theories of psychology to the complex science, language, and cognitive-oriented schools of the present day is startling. In many ways, enormous progress has been made in the understanding of the human brain, particularly since neuroscience, still in its infancy, helps us to understand the process of belief and how our minds react when confronted with oxygen deficiency and stimulation of certain vital areas of our brain. There are some theories concerning the future of religion or waning of religion that we shall glance at. We will spend considerable time with cognitivism and evolutionary psychology, but a great deal of time also on neuroscience and how it illuminates religious experience. A brief explanation. I was thinking of omitting the humanist and existential schools of psychology so popular in the middle of the last century, as they have been largely replaced by the cognitive paradigm. But when I began to research them, I found that young people had been reading their books and finding meaning and purpose in their lives from those readings. Despite their fading from the professional realm, they are still valued on the street, as it were. They have a place in the secular study of psychology, and so I have included them. I have spent some time with each psychology on its theory. With some patience, I think you will find that I am tying each theory in with our project of finding the relevance of the psychologies discussed tonight to atheism, our principal object of study. Atheist psychologies. Freud to cognitive psychologies. Our lecture will discuss atheist and or secular psychologists and psychology and their impact on Western society during the 20th and early 21st centuries. Freud and Skinner are emphasized along with two consequential psychologies of the present day, cognitive and evolutionary, with a brief glance at the humanist and existentialist schools. Freud and Skinner are discussed in the context of their psychological theories, the influence their theories had on 20th century thought, and what their atheism had to do with their psychologies. Freud's subjective and Skinner's objective psychologies have similarities in certain respects. They both maintain that human behavior is the outcome of complexly determined causal events that lie outside awareness. Both psychologies are products of a positivistic and materialistic worldview that believes people have deep-seated delusions and ignorance that prevent them from dealing with themselves and the world in an effective way. The two psychologies are dedicated to saving people from illusions. Both theories issued severe challenges to religious faith. Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939. Freud founded the psychoanalytic method, which was based on the belief that there were unconscious thoughts that influenced people's behavior and mental illness. He maintained that those thoughts could be accessed through the analytic technique of a dialogue between patient and practitioner. His life work was dedicated to trying to develop a cogent theory to explain all human behavior. Some of his most important theories were of the mind, the conscious, unconscious, and subconscious. The most well-known of Freud's concepts is the id, the inborn part of the mind, center of drives and passions, the ego, the reality principle that works for the preservation and well-being of the individual, and the superego, the mental watchdog that prevents transgressions and giving way to so-called immoral drives. Another important theory is the concept of the libido, the inborn drive that motivates us to strive and succeed, of which sex is a part. Freud's theory of the Oedipus complex, a boy's desire for his mother and competition with his father, is a cliché in the cultural vocabulary of the West. In a girl, the problem is called the Electra complex. Two other notable psychoanalytic concepts are defense mechanisms to prevent us from unpleasant ideas, and sublimation, translating our libidinal energies to higher aims, such as career, caring for others, study, and so on. Freud's persistent and robust critique of religion is of most interest to atheists. Freud not only banished religion from his home, but undertook an analysis of it as well, a devastating warfare he waged on a lifelong enemy. Peter Gay makes the point that Freud was a loyal son of the European Enlightenment, the last of the philosophers. His thinking owed a debt as well to Feuerbach, the atheist philosopher, and Feuerbach's work, The Essence of Christianity, in 1841. Freud commenced his critique of religion early in his career. His paper, Obsessive Actions in Religious Practices, in 1907, compared religious rituals to obsessional neurosis. He returned often to his theory that the Oedipus complex was one of the most important roots of religion. In his essay on the Italian Renaissance artist Leonardo da Vinci, he associated the belief in a personal God with a child's relation to his father. One of Freud's conclusions about Leonardo was that if Leonardo's imitation of his father hurt him as an artist, his rebellion against his father was the infantile determinant of what was perhaps an equally sublime achievement in the field of scientific research. Freud carried the concept of the Oedipal conflict's connection with religion even further in Totem and Tattoo in 1913, in which he noted the two prohibitions of most earlier totem clans. Members of those close-knit groups were not allowed to kill the totem animal and were prohibited from having sexual relations with the same totem members. He wrote that the following scenario had once taken place and had been repeated in many clans over the years. The strong and violent father of an early human tribe seized all the women for himself and drove off, killed, and ate the fierce father. Filled with guilt and remorse because they also loved and admired their father, they established a taboo figure, the totem animal, in his place and renounced their female relatives. Because it was established that many of the totem tribes celebrated an occasional ritual killing and eating of the totem, Freud was reinforced in his beliefs. He maintained that the concept of Oedipalism remains in Christianity up to the present. The sacrifice of Christ, who gave up his life and became reunited to his Father, was an excellent example of Oedipal theory, particularly since Christ then replaced the Father as the center of religious devotion. Freud was convinced the story was an Oedipal outcome. The eating of the Eucharist by religious followers is both identification with the Father and fresh elimination of him. In 1923, Freud repeated his assertions on the ego and the id and stated that religious and moral values came about from the earliest stages of human history and were the products of attempts to master the Oedipus complex. Freud's imaginative volume, Moses and Monotheism, written in 1937 and 1938, emphasized his belief that father murder was connected to religion. He maintained the biblical leader of his people, Moses, was not Jewish, but an Egyptian. Even the name Moses was an Egyptian one, Freud noted. He theorized that Moses was a follower of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, a monotheistic worshiper of the sun god Aten. After the pharaoh's death and return of the old polytheistic religion in Egypt, the disappointed Moses turned to the Jews and chose them as his protégés, particularly the Levites. He taught them Akhenaten's religion, instituted the regrettable practice of circumcision, and led them out of Egypt. However, they eventually rebelled against such a spiritualized religion and killed Moses. The Jewish tribes then worshipped a local god, Yahweh, bloodthirsty, jealous, and vengeful. Eventually, the two religions blended, and the religion of Moses dominated again. Freud believed that the Jewish people were indebted to this religion for a grand conception of a God, for having a sense of being a chosen people, and for pronounced intellectuality and self-control. Freud not only theorized about religion's historical roots, but also its personal roots in one of his most read books, The Future and Evolution, 1927. He maintained that religion is a very powerful illusion, which resists reason and observation, and he believed that particular religious illusions are fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind. Freud elaborated on the concept, positing that the personal roots of religion lay in the infantile past of the individual and her feelings of helplessness, often relieved by the ministrations of the mother and later the protective father. The grown person realizes that she is still helpless in the face of nature's force, other people's actions, forces within herself, and finally, death itself. Therefore, a benevolent provider is conjured up who protects us, punishes evil, rewards good, and promises a life after death. This irrational idea gives people a sense of being inviolable. The illusion is then extended from the provider to laws and institutions, which ostensibly protect, but also further restrain people. Freud worried if people could cope with the removal of illusional underpinnings, but he decided it might be possible. If the achievements of religion in respect to man's happiness, susceptibility to culture, and moral control are no better than this, Freud concluded, the question cannot but arise whether we are not overstating its necessity for mankind, and whether we do wisely in basing our cultural demands upon it. With all due respect to Freud, it can be considered an irony that the man who waged such a successful and long war against religious dogma ended with a system of thought that became dogmatic over time. Indeed, some critics have compared it to a secular religion of sorts. Freud apparently frequently compared himself to Moses. His assertions concerning the Oedipus complex and dream theory can be considered somewhat as belief systems, rather than scientific theory which must be tested again and again. He stated the Oedipus complex and dream theory were shibboleths that separated the believers from the unbelievers. He called the heresies of Jung and Adler, who were hounded out of his psychoanalytic community, resistance. Resistance was also how he characterized the opposition his theories met from the scientific community. He was a man with a message to spread. His writings inspired and consoled many people, as some say the tenets of religion do. In the last years of the 20th century, such difficulties contributed to the decline of the Freudian theory. Although Freudian theory is seldom taught in degree psychology courses today, Freud's theories have been of great consequence for Western society. He not only mounted an intellectual attack on religion, but his ideas have illuminated our own human capacity for self-deception. Freud attempted to minimize illusions' effects on our efforts to build a better world, one based on reason and scientific method. He changed, for the foreseeable future, the way we think about the human mind and its motivations. His discipline's vocabulary has entered the popular jargon, and the concepts of the unconscious, wish fulfillment, denial, and so on are used on the street today with ease, and the assumption that other people will immediately know what is meant by those terms. Freud brought out the gold and the dross of the human mentality, and people began once again to shift away from outdated religious dispositions. B.F. Skinner, 1904 to 1990. B.F. Skinner was a pioneer of the objectivist theory of behaviorism. Behaviorists believe that all behaviors are due to conditioning, acting, thinking, and feeling. They don't subscribe to internal physiological states or the concept of mind. Pavlov was Skinner's forerunner in classical conditioning. But Skinner devised methods that he believed were much more like learning in daily life. Skinner invented an operant conditioning apparatus called the Skinner box. A hungry rat is placed in the box and at some point presses a lever upon which food pellets are released. When the rat presses the lever again and again, food is released. When the rat, after a while, no food pellets are forthcoming, but the rat still continues to press the lever for a while. He is, in Skinner's terminology, operantly conditioned. The rat will continue to press the lever indefinitely as long as food is sometimes released, which Skinner called partial reinforcement. Skinner discovered that in general, The response time for partial reinforcement was about half a second. That is why he believed children should be corrected immediately for misbehavior. He thought the short response time for partial reinforcement accounted for the fact that the penal system does not work. A prisoner commits a crime, and by the time he is caught, tried, and put in prison, several months frequently elapse. That is too long, Skinner believed, for the punishment to be effective. What we are supposed to do with the prisoner's constitutional rights, I don't think he said. Although the results of Skinner's experiment with pigeons and the development of superstitious behavior are disputed by other psychologists, it is an interesting theory, and the story is worth repeating. Pigeons associated food release with whatever actions they had been performing at the moment of food delivery, and continued that behavior whether there was food delivered or not. One pigeon thrust his head into the corners of the cage. One turned counterclockwise, making 2 or 3 turns before food delivery. One developed tossing behavior, placing his head under an invisible bar and lifting and tossing his head. 2 extended their necks and then slung them back and forth. Although Skinner discussed this superstitious behavior with regard to gamblers' behavior, atheists will have no difficulty seeing a connection between the pigeon's actions and religious rituals. Animal advocates, however, will see the pigeon's reactions as stress due to captivity and experimentation. Skinner believed that education would help change people for the better if administered correctly. For example, teachers can write down what they intend to achieve with their pupils in the classroom, called behavioral objectives. Skinner's theories for classrooms were not popular until the 1960s. They were used fairly extensively with the arrival of computer-assisted learning, teaching machines, and programmed instruction. He was a great believer in positive reinforcement and thought the carrot was better than the stick. Skinner demonstrated what he considered an ideal society in his book, Walden II, in 1948. Please see AtheistScholar.org's list of books for a plot synopsis. For atheists, Skinner's secularism is the most important aspect of his theories. Many atheists will be interested in his ideas concerning religion, particularly in the earlier and most influential portion of his career. He believed that religions are designed to control behavior. Since he believed that all institutions act to control, he was only concerned with who controlled and how. He disliked the rigid controlling of dogmatic religion. He discussed how operant conditioning works in institutions of society, including politics, government, and religion, in his volume Science and Human Behavior, 1953. Skinner believed that a God was the archetypal pattern of an explanatory fiction, of a miracle-working mind, of the metaphysical. He explained that when people show what is described as pious behavior, they are exhibiting forms of behavior shaped by social environments. Skinner found the idea of a God was a useless concept. Behaviorism was a highly influential psychology until the second half of the 20th century, when cognitive psychology became the dominant paradigm. The two schools have much in common with practical therapeutical techniques such as cognitive behavioral therapy, which works with such problems as phobias and addictions. Present-day behaviorism thrives. There is a large association for behavioral analysis, International, and a Journal of Organizational Behavior Management. There are many special interest groups within the field dealing with such problems as developmental disabilities, cultural psychology, clinical psychology, verbal behavior, and behavioral analysis. Skinner attempted to apply his theories to language acquisition in his book Verbal Behavior in 1957. Noam Chomsky, a well-regarded linguist and philosopher, gave the theory and book a highly negative review and was instrumental in Skinner's language concept having been ignored. However, with the advent of new language theories in the present day, Skinner's language acquisition ideas have had a robust revival. Humanist and Existential Psychologies. Many psychologies sprang up about the time behaviorism began to wane. Two of the most popular were the Humanist school and the Existentialist school. Cognitive psychology began about the same time as the first two, but today it and its outgrowth, evolutionary psychology, have become the dominant paradigms. Humanist psychology disliked the reductionism of Skinner's behaviorism. It was not satisfied by Freudian negativity with its emphasis on mental illness, hatred, jealousy, anxiety, and so on. The humanists emphasized mental health and the means by which it could be attained. Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers were important pioneers in humanist psychology. Abraham Maslow was an atheist who believed that people needed satisfaction of their physiological needs, food, sleep, and etc., then of safety, then love and sexual satisfaction, and finally self-actualization, which included peak experiences when an individual is in harmony with himself and the world, and a person experiences a burst of wholeness and creativity. Maslow maintained that these events are profound, and that self-actualized people experience many of them. He called his theory the hierarchy of needs. Maslow studied healthy people as an alternative to Freudian practices with neurotics, which Maslow believed focused too exclusively on human illness. Although their methods were somewhat different, both Maslow and Rogers thought that individuals who reached full maturity were people who had an objective perception of reality and accepted their own nature, were committed to their work, were independent and yet caring of others, nonconformist, creative, and capable of the previously mentioned peak experiences. Erich Fromm was a humanist who started from a Judaic religious outlook, but moved to secularism more and more throughout his career. He tried to strike a middle ground between authoritarianism and moral relativism. He wrote on alienation, loneliness, self-awareness, and love. He believed we could achieve a sane, psychologically balanced society with the efforts of humans caring for each other. He was committed to helping people take independent action and living with reason and love rather than alienation. Fromm was a strong proponent of biophilia, love for humanity and nature, as well as independence and freedom. His values still hold for atheists and secular people devoted to shaping a sane and vibrant society where people are free to create and live fully and meaningfully. The most important and influential existential psychologists were Rollo May, Viktor Frankl, and Joseph Royce. May, Frankl, and Royce were theists, but their views on self-actualization are still compelling for people, including secular thinkers. Their thinking has relevance for our secular viewpoint. Joseph Royce discussed 4 points that he considered necessary for both psychology and religion to take into consideration. They were 1, the importance of self-realization, living one's life authentically. 2, the centrality of the non-rational in human life. 3, the significance of anxiety. And 4, the role of symbolic processes. Symbolic processes in psychoanalytic terms are disguised by and from the individual using them, are unconscious, and may not serve any conscious communication in the external world. Rollo May's theories were very much in the existential tradition of self-realization. He believed there were several stages a young person passed through to maturity. He saw the first as innocence, where the child is in a state of unknowing, then a rebellious state, and then a time of decision, when a person could make the proper decisions and go on to a creative life. However, the ordinary state, as May termed it, was always an alternative and negative choice. Some people would become anxious at having to accept full responsibility for their lives and would choose conformity and received opinion, as in religion. May found the society of his time troubled and distanced from the security of people caring for each other. He maintained society was developing the stance of separating love from sex and emotion from reason. May believed the care that people had for one another was the only real stabilizer for society, and that it was evaporating. Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor who lost his wife and parents in the Nazi death camps. He survived and found meaning in the entire horrific experience. He believed that even in the most sordid and painful surroundings, life has meaning. He stated that meaning can emerge from pain itself. He found that the lack of meaning was the most painful experience that modern man undergoes. He maintained that many people in the contemporary world suffer from boredom, apathy, and emptiness. Frankl originated the concept of logotherapy based on reason. He believed that people have a will to meaning and that the search for intention was the most powerful and motivating factor in human life. We can see where intention goes wrong, of course, in religion. New therapies, some of which seem to reduce humans to their physiological functions, and with the advent of antipsychotic, antidepressant, and other medications for human difficulties, make the theories of the humanist and existential schools of psychology appear more important than ever. Atheists are independent people, frequently with strong humanist beliefs. They are already on the path of self-actualization by their secular stance, which necessitates nonconformity, self-responsibility, and commitment to freedom. Men such as Maslow and Fromm have much to offer the secular community in the way of direction and inspiration. Cognitive psychology. From about 1920 to the 1960s, many psychologists were behaviorists, but then came a general rejection of behaviorism, denial of mentalism. Psychologists realized it was not possible to eliminate concepts of beliefs and desires when studying the human mind. The advent of computers and discussions of artificial intelligence put behaviorist learning theories to the test, and those theories were frequently refuted. The mind was once again accepted as a valid scientific concept. Cognitive psychology studies how people think, remember, speak, perceive, and solve problems. It provides atheists with some insight into the thought processes of clinging to beliefs. Cognitive psychologists describe the mind as a kind of computer. What they mean is that the brain functions as a set of operations for processing information. The brain is something like a machine that runs the mind. Unlike earlier analogies, the computer-mind analogy is more salient, as they both have the same function, processing information. In the late 50s, Noam Chomsky discovered that a general-purpose learning program did not learn languages as well as young children. David Marr discovered that creating a software program to recognize and differentiate objects was extremely difficult. Many psychologists now realize the mind was far more complex than had been imagined. The American philosopher Jerry Fodor came to an interesting conclusion in 1983. He stated that the mind could not be a single general purpose program, but a collection of many special purpose programs, each with its own rules. Cognitive beginnings came from several dissident behaviorists. In 1960, Bruner and Miller established the Center for Cognitive Studies at Harvard, and Ulrich Nesser published Cognitive Psychology in 1967. Not all cognitive psychologists accept the modular theory of the mind, but many do, and the theory has become very influential. Cognitive science is investigating knowledge as a kind of informational processing, as we have seen. And such work is helping understand human mental processes. This helps us to understand religious belief and intelligent people. We are beginning to learn that the knowledge that often creates behavior is much more fragmented, compartmentalized, and situation-specific than we had thought. Previously, we assumed that a particular belief, as David C. Noel points out, was a kind of proposition, a statement or a sentence that is marked with propositional attitude that indicates that the statement is believed to be true. We apparently may not have a single set of beliefs that can be applied in any given situation, which would create a certain consistency. Knowledge is arguably very much fragmented when confronted by different processes, and the skill levels are not equal. This means that knowledge that is consistently used and remembered in one situation might be ignored or contradicted in another. We are all too aware, most of us, of our own inconsistencies, and therefore, this theory, coming from the cognitive realm, is of interest. Some scholars are beginning to think that it's a mistake to ascribe sets of belief in individuals rather than terming them as merely regularities in behavior. Such theories certainly help to explain the consistently inconsistent behavior ignored or not noticed in religious people. The so-called domain specificity of knowledge and cognitive skills helps to clarify why people competent and knowledgeable in one field, such as science, display such poor reasoning in others, such as religion. Noel states the process of learning about the world is one in which raw, uninterpreted experiences are analyzed in search of robust regularities is possibly untrue. Apparently, people exhibit peak reasoning performance in fields that they know, if they have adequate opportunities to practice them often. But unfortunately, skills learned in one context do not cross over very well to a context or area people are unfamiliar with. Confronted by a novel issue, they often fail terribly. We know most people don't receive much practice, if any, reasoning about religious beliefs. Indeed, they are often discouraged from such reasoning. We humans also seem to be hypothesis-driven, at least working hypothesis-driven. We have these hypotheses about the world and its nature that can modify by encounters with experience. Even more importantly, we remember experiences that conform to our hypotheses better than those that do not. Scholars call this confirmation bias evidence, which is evidence that we encounter that confirms our so-called current hypothesis and that tends to be remembered. Evidence that does not confirm it tends to be forgotten. So we have what cognitive psychologists call resistance to belief revisions. Psychologists have also found that such resistances very much apply to multitudes of our interpretations, such as religion or politics. Pascal Boyer, a French anthropologist, is one of the leading figures in the cognitive psychology of religion. Some of the most important concepts in the field that are of interest to atheists is the idea that religion is a cognitive byproduct of such cognitive mechanisms as agent detection of predators and counterintuitive concepts such as talking rocks and disembodied spirits, which make some of these counterintuitions striking enough to be remembered. David C. Noel discusses the theory in his article on cognitive science in the New Encyclopedia of Unbelief. Pascal Boyer believes that religion is a byproduct of evolutionary adaptations and that as a result, it will be very difficult to eradicate it. His book, Religion Explained, The Evolutionary Origins of Religious Thought, 2001, while not living up to its title, is an excellent elucidation of religion for atheists interested in some of its evolutionary roots. Adherents of the byproduct theory are growing. They include prestigious researchers such as Armin Getz and Ara Norenzayan, who study a religion, religious thought, and its impact on human behavior. Although belief in the supernatural may be a cognitive byproduct, there is an idea that such beliefs have helped motivate pro-social behavior. Scott Atran and H. Heinrich have authored an important, sophisticated article concerning this thinking. But secular readers will have no trouble remembering the many antisocial and vicious behaviors connected with religious belief through the centuries. The lecture will peruse some other theories of religion before moving on to Steven Pinker and the evolutionary psychology theory he embraces. There are three theories concerning religion that have currency at present. The first being the concept of secularization. This is the idea that science and technology will replace religion, which was Freud's thinking in Future of an Illusion. The second theory is that social disintegration and individualism will result in spiritual seeking, not toward organized religion, but rather multiple religious and spiritual systems. including New Age spiritualism. Lastly, Ronald Engelhardt argues that religion developed to fill human needs for security, and that the social and economic security in Europe has brought about secularization. Religion grows in the third world, where social and economic conditions are poor. In addition, James Lobe has published a psychological study of religious mysticism. He has found that the mystical experience is very similar to drug-induced experience. He maintains that religion should be treated naturalistically. Steven Pinker, a contented atheist, finds religion a puzzle. He does not consider adaptationist ideas cogent because religion does not meet the criteria, he says, for adaptation. In a speech he gave in Madison, Wisconsin in 2004, he stated that it was unclear why the mind would receive comfort from a falsehood, such as religion. He mentioned many possible reasons for spiritual beliefs, including elders wanting to be assured good treatment by making people think that they will be around forever as immortals, rites of passage, asking God for stuff, and recovery from illness. But he admits that he does not have one single theory concerning religion. Pinker, a cognitive psychologist, has embraced the concept of evolutionary psychology as a means for explaining human nature. Pinker articulated the theoretical underpinnings of the now popular paradigm of EP and How the Mind Works 2007 and The Blank Slate, The Denial of Human Nature in 2003. Robert Wright wrote a shorter volume, The Moral Animal, in 1995, which contained similar concepts. Evolutionary psychology sees human nature as a universal set of evolved psychological adaptations to recurring problems in the ancestral environment. Evolutionary psychologists maintain that the human brain has hundreds, perhaps thousands of modules for special tasks and purposes. Leda Cosmides, a psychologist, and John Tooby, an anthropologist, who are among the leading proponents of EP, believe that each of these modules has a specific task. EP maintains that our adaptations are based on brains that evolved up to the time of the late Stone Age culture when people were hunter-gatherers. EP's adherents, such as Steven Pinker, claim that the human brain has not had time to evolve since the beginning of agricultural societies about 10,000 years ago. Pinker states that for 99% of human existence, people lived as foragers in small nomadic bands. There is a general assumption that some of our present behavior is maladaptive, not based on the way we live now in cities and with technology, but centered in Stone Age adaptations to life on the African savanna. Hunter-gatherers lived in small, tight-knit groups with a great deal of social interaction. Their environment was hot and grassy. The modules that humans developed helped with taking care of children, mate selection, avoiding predators, eating the correct foods, reading other people's minds, and so on. Humans in today's very different environments are responding to many situations with a hunter-gatherer mentality. Pinker states that we are now enticed to non-adaptive choices. This lecture does not deny the probability that contemporary people must carry with them some traits from earlier human societies, but there is so little knowledge as yet about those earlier societies that any theories concerning this matter must remain highly speculative. Evolutionary psychology is very au courant at the moment, but philosophers and scientists know that popular theories that attempt to explain people come and go and frequently shed little light ultimately on the difficulties of human behavior. There are numerous criticisms of EP. David J. Buller, the theory's most eloquent and devastating opponent, has written a book, Adapting Minds 2006, which claims that there is very little empirical evidence for EP's theories. He devotes an entire chapter to debunking a study that claimed data compiled on stepchildren's abuse demonstrated that abuse was higher for stepchildren than that of natural children. The researchers maintain that their findings bore out EP theories of parental solicitude as an earlier adaptation. By examining the data carefully, Biller finds that the evidence does not conform to the study's predictions. Biller has written an article for Scientific American Special Issue on Evolution, 4 Fallacies of Pop Evolutionary Psychology, in which he robustly attacks 4 foundational theories of EP. The first is that analysis of Pleistocene adaptive difficulties can shed light on the mind's design. Not only do we have little evidence for discovering what social relations took place in the Stone Age, but in extant hunter-gatherer societies there is considerable variation of lifestyles, even in the regions of Africa where earlier humans lived. The next theory is that we can discover why distinctly human traits such as language evolved, but Bueller explains we do not have enough evidence for that. We do not know what motivated humans to an adaptation as language, while our closest relatives, the chimpanzee and bonobo, do not have language. We need hard evidence to identify the environmental demands that drove our evolutionary separation from our close relatives. The third theory is that we are stuck with Stone Age minds because of the slowness of evolution. But Buller states that recent studies have demonstrated that selections can radically alter the life history traits of a population in as few as 18 generations. For humans, that is roughly 450 years. The fourth and last fallacy of EP, states Buller, is that its psychological data provide clear evidence for the EP theory. But Buller has discovered that the data are based on fixed answer questions and a limited array of behavioral data. At best, the evidence is inconclusive. Jaak Panksepp and Jules B. Panksepp are among the articulate critics of evolutionary psychology. In their article, The 7 Sins of Evolutionary Psychology, they criticize EP's theory of brain modules. They state, "It is equally sad to see clear disregard for the likelihood that much of our neocortex is based upon general purpose engineering principles rather than genetically guided modules." Buller is a philosopher, and this lecture now returns to his volume Adapting Minds for a final critique of evolutionary psychology. This is a difficult criticism to discuss because there are distinguished atheists in EP's ranks. Buller finds EP simply views evolutionary theory as an alternative to creation by God, as an explanation of the production of complex psychological design. It, EP, retains the structure of the theoretical framework of natural theology. Atheists will be pleased to discover that many of evolutionary psychologists' critics are secular thinkers, who are not so much motivated to critique EP as to find out how the mind functions. They want to accomplish this discovery with genuine scientific methods and not by coming to premature conclusions. Jerry A. Coyne, the author of Why Evolution is True and an atheist, does not believe that evolutionary biology is a panacea for all the world's ills. In his review of David Sloan Wilson's The Neighborhood Project, he cautions that understanding human nature by speculating on the behavior of early humans will not solve the problems of society. He emphasizes that we have little evidence that selection on groups has promoted the evolution of any trait. Our world, Coyne states, is no longer the one in which we evolved. We should keep in mind that it is we who have constructed the contemporary world. Coyne has an interesting website, whyevolutionIstrue.com. Neuroscience is just beginning to make inroads in learning how consciousness works and what motivates religious beliefs, out-of-body experiences, and other illusions. Scientists have already explained that the mind is a function of the brain. There is no disconnected soul commanding the actions of human beings. We are at the threshold of understanding why we believe falsehoods and why we have the capacity to imagine and then realize technology, art, and other inventions that enrich our lives. Neuroscience. Neuroscience is a scientific study of the nervous system. This process advanced during the last part of the 20th century due to revolutions in molecular biology, electrophysiology, and computational neuroscience. We now understand the processes of a single neuron, but not how networks of neurons produce complex cognitions and behaviors. It is important to keep in mind that the split of psychiatry and neurology came about in the early 20th century. Psychiatry studied subjective experience in the mind, while neurology focused on the physical brain. Then came the explosion of technology that allowed us to visualize the brain. Functional MRI and position emission tomography, PET scans, permitted us for the first time to see how the brain worked and where it was active or inactive as it performed such tasks as speech, memory, complex thinking, body movement, sex, and dreaming. Scientists are getting closer to seeing how the brain works in near death, out of the body, and other so-called mystical experiences that people report. These episodes are real to those who have experienced them, and many researchers have concluded that it is simply not scientific to dismiss them all as dreaming or fabrications. It is necessary to examine what is appearing in the brain during these moments of extreme experience. Neuroscience may be able to provide naturalized explanations of religious belief and religious experience. I have chosen 4 books from the neuroscience section of AtheistScholar.org, as well as Sam Harris's 2 experiments concerning belief and unbelief to discuss this evening. The texts are all contributions to our understanding of the mind and brain working in tandem and not as separate entities. Neuroscience is helping in the advance of understanding our brains and our experience. Colin McGinn, an atheist philosopher, however, delivers a caution. He maintains that we may never know the nature of consciousness, free will, or other questions. He believes that we are confusing cognitive questions with conceptual ones. Patricia S. Churchland is the author of Brain Trust, What Neuroscience Tells Us About Morality. She is a neuroscientist and a MacArthur Award winner. Brain Trust is a lucid discussion of the effect of oxytocin's stress-reducing effect on the human hormonal makeup. Oxytocin is an ancient body-brain molecule that allows us to develop trust. Churchill believes morality originated in our brains and presents a salient argument for her theory. She discusses the neurobiological pattern of bonding in combination with evolutionary cultural values that have led to human morality. Our brain, she believes, has evolved not only to care for our own self-preservation, but for the well-being of an ever-enlarging circle of people, children, mates, kin, and so on. Pain is felt when we are excluded, and pleasure when surrounded by loving friends. And as a result, our brains adjust their circuitry in conformance with local customs. Brain Trust causes the reader to reevaluate the priority given to religion, absolute rules, and reason as basis for morality. Churchland is a proponent of many evolutionary psychology tenets. Since some of these concepts are in dispute, atheists who are skeptical concerning EP's scientific basis may not be interested in Brain Trust. But her theories are an addition to the naturalistic thinking of the brain's biology and the formation of human culture. Antonio Damasio is a well-regarded author and researcher who seems to be reaching back to certain behavioral concepts about the human brain. Damasio is one of a group of neuroscientists studying consciousness who became engaged with emotion. He is chief neurologist at the University of Iowa Medical Center and has written a provocative book, Looking for Spinoza, Joy, Sorrow, and the Feeling Brain, 2003. According to Colin McGinn, the outspoken atheist philosopher, Damasio promotes 3 theories in Spinoza. The first of these theories is that we do not cause bodily symptoms by our emotions, but first we cry and then are sad. Feelings, Damasio states, are shadows of the external manner of emotions. His second idea is that a feeling is identical to an idea. If you are afraid of a bear, what you are really aware of is the symptoms of fear-racing heart, sweaty palms, and so on. Third, all mental states consist of varying types of bodily awareness. Damasio states, the mind is built from ideas that are in one way or another brain representations of the body. He quotes Spinoza, the object of the idea constituting the human mind is the body. McGinn maintains that Damasio's idea is unoriginal and false. He states that William James and Lang both thought of the concept in the 1880s and that the idea is the stuff of old-style behavioral psychology. McGinn believes there is an interplay between feelings and bodily expressions rather than a one-way dependence. In any case, Damasio's ideas are a welcome addition to theories concerning the brain. His thinking merits consideration from atheist thinkers. Another book of Damasio's, Self Comes to Mind, Constructing the Conscious Brain, in 2010, has been critically reviewed by John Searle in the New York Review of Books. Searle discusses the quest for understanding what consciousness is and how it functions, and states that he considers this issue the most important question in the biological sciences today. His article contains a footnote with references to books on consciousness by important thinkers in the field since around 1992 to the present. He has reviewed books by such writers as Roger Penrose and Daniel C. Dennett. Please see AtheistScholar.org Neuroscience for the reference to the article, a very important one. Consciousness is very important to areas of belief and disbelief. Michael S. Gazzaniga's The Ethical Brain, 2005, has been referred to in Applied Ethics, Stem Cell Research, and in Determinism and Free Will in the Atheist Scholar. He served on the President's Council on Bioethics and is a preeminent neuroscientist. Gazzaniga writes in a plain-spoken and non-condescending style on an array of important contemporary issues such as stem cell research, abortion, mind enhancement through drugs, aging brains, and more. His logical and controversial opinions are thought-provoking, even when the reader may be prompted to disagree. Gazzaniga's short discussion of religion in The Ethical Brain will be of interest to many atheists. The statistics he cites concerning religion in the world are troubling. There are still 2 to 3 religions being founded every day, with a total of 10,000 religions in 2005. Since 1993, the depiction of religious symbols and spirituality on television has risen by 400%. Gazzaniga has some provocative things to report concerning temporal lobe epilepsy, which affects about 1 million Americans and is undiagnosed in possibly another million. These patients frequently appear fairly normal and their symptoms are mild. They do not pass out or have spastic muscle reactions during epileptic seizures, but they may not be able to speak for a second or seem somewhat dazed. One of the 5 traits of the Geschwind syndrome, as it is called, is a prevalence of reported religious experience during seizures and a fairly intense religiosity between episodes. The brain's temporal lobe is also activated when people not suffering from epilepsy undergo religious experiences or during auditory hallucinations. So the connection between temporal lobe stimulation and religious experience is tantalizing. The entire chapter of The Believing Brain is worth reading, as Gazzaniga discusses out-of-the-body experiences, how researchers stimulate parts of the brain to create religious experiences, and the brain's workings when creating a sense of self. Gazzaniga hopes that someday people can come to a consensus on a universal moral system by basing what we know about the brain now and what we will learn in the future. He would like to combine that scientific knowledge with an understanding of how we humans depend on biased tales from the past. At the same time, he believes our thinking about ethical concerns should be refreshed. Gazzaniga maintains that our species wants to believe in something, a natural order, and that there is no other path than for science to provide ideas for how that order should be characterized. He has of late, however, begun to conclude that science is not going to provide us with an ethical framework very soon, if ever. He now takes the position that responsibility results in interaction with other people, and that science cannot solve our ethical dilemmas. He believes that we must undertake problems such as responsibility, personal, societal, and legal, on our own, and not depend completely on scientific research in these areas. He believes dependence on science on such issues may be a dead end. Sam Harris, the renowned atheist author and neuroscientist, has performed 2 experiments concerning truth statements, false statements, and undecidable statements. They are labeled respectively belief, unbelief, and uncertainty in the first experiment, which covered a wide category range of statements: ethical, semantic, factual, mathematical, and so on. 44 adults judged written statements in these categories, and using MRI, their brain sections were activated at differentially distinct regions in the prefrontal and parietal cortices, as well as the basal ganglia. Unbelief and belief activated relatively primal regions of the brain. In the second experiment, 15 committed Christians and 15 committed atheists assessed the truth or falsity of religious and non-religious propositions while being assessed by MRI. For both, statements of belief, sentences judged as either true or false, were associated with increased activation of the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, a region associated with emotional judgment, processing uncertainty, assessing rewards, thinking about oneself, and so on. Harris and his fellow researchers state that the difference between belief and disbelief was the same, regardless of what was being thought about. Another interesting finding of the experiments was that true statements were judged as believable faster than those judged unbelievable or undecidable. Disbelief appears to require a subsequent process of rejection. Michael Shermer reports that Harris and his colleagues believe that these results support the conjecture of the 17th century philosopher Spinoza, who thought that mere comprehension of a statement entails the tacit acceptance of its being true. He thought that belief comes naturally and easily to people, and skepticism arrives slowly and feels unnatural. Please once again see AtheistScholar.org Neuroscience for reference to these experiments. Kevin Nelson's work and his volume, The God Impulse, Is Religion Hardwired into the Brain, in 2011, is paradoxical and at the same time extremely helpful for the secular community, as he provides naturalistic explanations for many phenomena such as near-death experiences and so on. He is a well-regarded neuroscientist, and I found his volume so helpful and well-researched that I am recommending it despite certain reservations I entertain about him and his recent activities. Dr. Kevin Nelson has been receiving a reputation for belief in mystical experiences and for predictions of a new direction for spirituality in the future. However, the volume The God Impulse is an excellent review of many facts that neuroscientists have learned concerning the material processes the brain undergoes during mystical occurrences, and how parts of the brain can be stimulated to achieve those occurrences. The atheist reader is advised to read the book for its naturalistic approach to near-death, out-of-the-body, spirit twins, and so on. Nelson has been a neuroscientist for over 30 years, and his explanation for mysterious episodes concerns what takes place inside the physical brain. There is not a hint of any transcendent force or spirit causing the reported episodes in the God Impulse. In fact, to Dr. Nelson's credit, despite any beliefs he may sustain, he maintains that statements from religious or other concerned parties about mystical experiences proving that there is a God are deplorable. Nelson's ability to communicate to people with little or no background in science is helpful, and many atheists will close this book with a greater understanding of the natural functions of the brain under pressure or deficiency of different types, such as oxygen deficiency, that give rise to unusually concentrated reactions. Nelson explains that near-death experience is reliably caused by stimulating the brain in the temporal parietal region. The tunnel and light reported by many near-death patients is a natural phenomenon according to Nelson. The visual brain is stimulated in near-death, and the severely low blood pressure causes the eye's retina to lose peripheral vision, creating a tunnel. Ambient light comes through our eyelids and strikes the retina, and then the light is conveyed to the brain, which is on the edge of consciousness. By this time, smudges of light at the end of the tunnel are perhaps all the brain can see. The orbital prefrontal lobe is the region that responds to so-called reward, such as food, flavor, texture, temperature, and so on. It is a motivator, but it can be a negative factor, causing some of us to crave heroin and cocaine. Dr. Nelson theorizes that it is this area of the brain that may be responsible for the brain's belief that it will have a reward as it is near death or trying to reach enlightenment. Nelson explains the distorted sense of self, oneness with the universe, REM states, out-of-the-body experiences, life after death states, and much more with scientific precision and a plain-spoken, easy-to-understand style. The text presents empirically tested, peer-reviewed examinations of our mind-body experiences, which are all based on physical, even primal brain-body functions, according to Nelson. Is Nelson using spiritual for lack of a better word? Or does he have a spiritual agenda that he sugarcoats? One need not agree with him, but read him for his well-communicated and naturalistic theories. Such an eminent neuroscientist as V.S. Ramachandran calls God Impulse a bold, provocative, and highly readable account. Richard Dawkins calls Ramachandran the Marco Polo of neuroscience. Atheists will come away with evidence, explanation, and conviction concerning the natural, non-spiritual sources of mystical experience. Nelson is recommended with caution. As with Nelson and Gazzaniga, many researchers and the neuroscientists have discovered that, for instance, the outer layers of the cortical tissue of the temporal lobe contain very high abilities to have knowledge about the appearance of visual objects, including faces. This area also processes linguistic meaning, and it is possible that if stimulated in an inappropriate manner, it will seem to hear voices or messages from unseen sources, like God. Sense of self perhaps can be disrupted by stimulating the areas deep in the temporal lobe that are associated with autobiographical memory. That might make the sense of self disappear temporarily or seem to make thoughts come from other agents. Some of these deep temporal areas are also associated with emotional processes, and stimulating them may give a religious experience a deep personal sense of significance. Sometimes when electrical activity is induced by magnetic fields, hallucinations are produced akin to religious experience in people. There are many other reactions that can be induced by stimulation of different areas of the brain, and many of these experiments point more and more to mystical experiences of many types as having natural rather than supernatural causes. It must be emphasized, however, that such hypotheses need much further testing, as no definite answers have yet emerged. But the emerging field of neuroscience may have much to tell us and to confirm that the so-called supernatural experiences people relate actually have very natural causes. The end of our quick look at the progress of neuroscience is an excellent place to pause and remind ourselves of Colin McGinn's caveat that we are only at the beginning of understanding the mind-body connection. Despite promising experiments, many of our theories about the brain and mind are still speculative. Hopes that science may clarify and construct a universal morality may be overly optimistic. Still, as David Wolf states in his volume Psychology of Religion, Classical and Contemporary, 1997, There is no other approach in the psychology of religion that promises as revolutionary a future as the biological one. And now a segue into the world of feeling rather than reason. A curious book has come out on Kindle recently and is due to be published in book form in November. It has already received several critical reviews. I have been somewhat at a loss concerning into which lecture and which section of AtheistScholar.org I should place it. The ideas could easily be discussed in anthropology, sociology, or psychology. I have decided to discuss it this evening for our lecture in Atheist Psychologies, because it is a confirmation of our secular suspicions that religion frequently brainwashes its adherents. But even more importantly, it points once again to the very real difficulty of convincing religious people that there is no transcendent other. The volume's title is When God Talks Back, Understanding the American Evangelical Relationship with God, by a psychological anthropologist at Stanford University, T.M. Luhrmann. She is now a believer herself, but her study is apparently fairly valid and an insightful look into an influential portion of the evangelical Christian community. It is a salient explanation for the idea of some 21st century Christians' belief that God speaks to them. It is important for atheists to try to understand what process or processes are at work to cause people in the modern age to believe in and live by such an outmoded concept. Luhrmann did her fieldwork at the Chicago and Northern California Vineyard Christian Fellowship, which has a huge influence in evangelical culture, particularly because Vineyard produces popular gospel music. It is a rather young, although highly influential denomination which practices a rather watered-down form of Pentecostalism. Its members pray to be healed, speak in tongues, and attempt to achieve concrete experience of God's so-called realness. Their leaders, Luhrmann has found, coach their members in a new theory of mind. They come to believe in an intimate God who speaks to them personally because they have learned how to do so. Their practice is taken up with doing with their mind rather than merely thinking. I quote, "People train the mind in such a way that they experience part of their mind as the presence of God." This practice of the Vineyard Fellowship demonstrates the type of prayer that for the last 40 years or so has become widespread among evangelical circles, although Vineyard's prayer practice is somewhat more magnified. Critics have been quick to point out that Luhrmann's implication that the Vineyard's practice of speaking directly to God and hearing his voice in one's private thoughts is a new manifestation is incorrect. The Puritans filled their diaries with such self-questioning and supplications, and the Old Testament contains much of the same practice, with the book of Job being the most well-known example. But her research is basically sound. Here is a quote from her again. "God wants to be your friend. You develop that relationship through prayer. Prayer is hard work and requires effort and training. And when you develop that relationship, God will answer back through thoughts and mental images he places in your mind and through the sensations in your body." The worshippers sincerely believe, by using the psychological insights of modern psychotherapy and ancient spiritual traditions, that by praying in this manner, they will transform themselves and their prayer will be an incredible force in real life. A member believes that her failure to pray properly caused another member to suffer a miscarriage. Some worshippers also believe they will attain not merely spiritual, but material acquisitions. For secular people, one of the most interesting observations Luhrmann makes is how the worshippers attempt to deal with the problem of the non-answer of prayer and or when God's presence appears to wane. Presto, it is not a sign of failure, but spiritual success. They explain that their faith is so strong, they do not need God to prove it to them. These members of the Vineyard are not mentally ill. They know that there is an element of what critics call "let's pretend" in their imaginings. when, as one pastor recommends, they pour his own cup of coffee for God in the morning, or when visualizing biblical events, they know they are using techniques to sharpen their worship skills. Let us hope so. But they are practicing a kind of cognitive behavioral therapy. One of their popular training manuals is Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Life, which is folksy and not very intellectual. But some members are actually working with the Catholic St. Ignatius's spiritual exercises, that old chestnut for training the mind to focus on the relationship with God. Lerman seems intent on explaining that evangelicals are part of yet another American Great Awakening that came about in the 60s, a rejection of dogma and an emphasis on feeling. She seems to believe that evangelicals are steeped in feeling and that dogma is unimportant to them. But critics are quick to point out that evangelicals have a very significant thought process as well as a feeling one. What then does one make of their belief in the infallibility of the Bible, or of the large influence their ideas exert on American politics, and the attempts of some of them to make those ideas into law which all Americans must follow? Surely these are not just feelings but ideas, and dogmatic ideas at that. Still, this volume has given us a unique perspective. William James and Friedrich Schleiermacher also subjected religious belief to psychological analysis, and there seems to be a growing field in the scientific study of prayer. Let us hope, given the prejudice of some current psychologists in the direction of religion, that these studies will be evidence-informed and neutral. Many of us in the secular community will be wary of such studies unless they prove to be trustworthy. When God talks back, gives us insight into the difficulty of using reason when disputing with evangelicals and hoping to have influence on their thinking. It is proving very difficult to develop a strategy for discoursing with them. It may be close to impossible. How do we combat the fixed conviction of people who believe that God himself has told them he is real and with whom they feel as a part of their mind? For they do believe that part of their mind contains the presence of God. Perhaps the most rational and effective course might be for the secular community to focus on issues of church and state to protect our rights and work to keep science curricula strong in our public schools. There are many people drifting away from religion, about 14% to 20% of the United States population. Religion continues its decline. We need to reach those people who are becoming ever more disaffected with religion. Our message of reason will likely resonate fully with those who are already on the path of rationality and science and who want to experience happier and freer lives away from myths and childlike dependence on a personal God. It is such people who do not need God as a presence in their mind who will be attracted to critical and independent thought. This question of whether the religious fundamentalists can be reasoned away from belief will continue to be a very vexing one for atheists for a long time to come. At this juncture of our psychology lecture, I would like to comment on the fact that there has been a movement afoot in psychology as well as sociology to, and I quote from Psychology Today, to integrate spirituality into their psychological therapy activities. Here is another quote from a paper by Thomas J. Plant from Psychology Today in 2007. Professional and scientific psychology appears to have rediscovered spirituality and religion during recent years with a large number of conferences, seminars, workshops, books, and speeches in major professional journals on spirituality and psychology integration. As I conclude this lecture, I would like all my listeners and viewers to consider psychology's drift from the analysis and disdain toward religion that the giants in the field such as Freud, Skinner, and Adler once displayed. Despite some of my qualms concerning evolutionary psychology, I am pleased and relieved that so many of its adherents are secular, and equally pleased that so are many of EP's critics. Let us hope that psychology professionals will continue to review the studies being conducted on prayer and related spiritual topics to assure that those studies are evidence-based, peer-reviewed, and capable of replication. There is no God, no magical prayer. Values come from individuals and their societies, not from some transcendental other. They come from mature individuals who have left behind their childlike dependence on a super parent who will protect and save them. It is time for science to rule once again in psychological classrooms, offices, and journals, and not spirituality. It is time to toss away or leave to children the concept of let's pretend. Mankind's secular journey has just begun. Thank you for your patience and attention this evening.